So welcome everyone to the second Global Change Seminar hosted by the USGS Southeastern Climate Adaptation Science Center and the Global Change Fellows. We are joined today by three panelists to hear about Indigenous leadership and conservation from Yellowstone to Yukon and the incredible projects they are working on. My name is Julianne Reese. I'll be moderating this seminar. And I just ask that participants that are joining us keep your audio muted and your video off, and save any questions you might have until the end during the Q&A session. And you can also put them in the chat just to facilitate a smooth seminar. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers who we are so excited to have with us today to tell us about the incredible work that they've been doing. Adam Linnard, Latasha Robe, and Elliot Fox. Adam Linnard is from the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. Adam is the Alberta Program Manager on Treaty 7 territory, and he guides campaigns to protect key wildlife habitat and works for sustainable, justice-oriented, thriving communities that make space for other than human beings as well. Y2Y is a conservation organization doing regional work to facilitate wildlife connectivity and bring partners together, seeking to support human diversity, equity, inclusion, and to oppose actions and policies that undermine these principles. And Adam will definitely tell us more about the work he's been doing. Latasha Robe of the Kainai First Nation is the founder of the Niitsítapi Water Protectors, a grassroots collective formed in response to the threat of open pit coal development projects in the eastern slopes. Latasha, through NWP, has led a number of on-reserve community awareness campaigns to help bring awareness to First Nation community members who will be impacted from open pit mining, and is working to slow the approval process for mining through the organization. Elliot Fox, the Indigenous Consultant Assistant Project Manager of the Blackfoot Confederacy Native Trout Recovery Project, a member of the Kainai First Nation, has over 25 years of private and public service experience in land, environment, and natural resource conservation and management arena. The Blackfoot Confederacy Native Trout Recovery Project's mission is to collaborate, restore, protect, honor, and enhance the collective culture, language, and self-identity of the Blackfoot people. If you all want to do brief introductions before you get started on your presentations, feel free to do so now.
Sure, I'll go. So my name's Adam Linnard. I'm in a town called Exshaw in Alberta, Canada. It's a place known as Champe Oda in the Arhe Nakota language, which means the place of many stumps. And the sad reason for that is because of all of the Douglas fir trees that were cut down to fuel the cement plant. I have academic and professional backgrounds in international poverty relief, environmental literary criticism, and environmental justice. And now I do large landscape conservation work. We'll leave it at that.
Oki nasukwa nisto anasta Matoomiikamoosaaki nin anasta unistaksanam Knox anasta gapi ginapiaki amai mushmig hokomar Willie and Shirley Oje bugakes the nanix sipi sagoma be expected the wheat to be an itspitsiaki note do gana and I'm a part of the Mamweets, which is the fish eaters clan. And Blackfoot, I just introduced myself from who I am and where I'm from. I'm from the Kainai First Nation, which is currently located in what's known as Southern Alberta. It's one of the members, one of the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I myself am from the Blood tribe there. I have a professional background in a business, actually, in social innovation and systems change theory. I was fortunate enough to be raised on the Blood Reserve, surrounded by culture and community and Blackfoot knowledge forms in its many different forms and the ways that it's presented. And so I'm able to talk a lot about Blackfoot relations to water and land in the Eastern Slopes area. And I'll give it to Elliot.
Okay, Niitsítapi, Niitsítapi. Hello, everybody. I just said hello, friends and relatives. I'm glad to see everybody today. And I just introduce myself with my Blackfoot name. It translates to a wolf collar. So it was a healer from the 1800s. So I received his name, and he used to wear a wolf pelt around his neck, so wolf collar. Anyway, yeah, like Latasha, I'm from the Kainai, or the Blood Tribe in southern Alberta. I'm home right now on the southern end of the Blood Reserve, right across the highway from the town of Cardston. And I'm about 15 minutes north of the US border and about a half hour east of Waterton Lakes National Park and the Rocky Mountains. Yeah, so I graduated from Lethbridge College in 1994 in the Environmental Science and Renewable Resource Management program. And so I've worked with Parks Canada, Alberta Fish and Wildlife, and with our local communities, the Blood Tribe and the Beekani, as a technician, fish and wildlife technician. And then I became a manager with the Blood Tribe. I directed the land management department for 15 years. And I stepped away about 8 years ago. And I'm now doing independent consulting. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, who I am. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for that and introducing yourselves. We're going to start with Adam with his presentation first. So I'll just let him share his screen and get started talking about his projects.
There we go. All right, so thank you very much, Julianne. So my presentation today is going to begin with a quick introduction to the Yellowstone Yukon Conservation Initiative, or Y2Y as we call it. I'm going to talk a little bit about like the scientific underpinnings of large landscape conservation and the Y2Y vision. And then I'm going to talk about some of the lessons and some of the questions that are arising for large landscape conservation from growing Indigenous sovereignty movements. Y2Y, the organization, is an international conservation nonprofit that's dedicated to protecting core wildlife habitats. So by designating protected areas, for example, and finding ways to ensure that wildlife can move between those core areas the way they've always done, and in fact, the way that they have to do in order to maintain their genetic diversity and their viable population levels in the landscape. We do that in an area that's twice the size of Texas. That crosses the Canada-US border, goes from Yellowstone National Park to the Arctic Circle. It's the territories of at least 75 different Indigenous nations and communities. And we work at that scale particularly because that's the scale that animals have actually told us that they need. So Y2Y is a large landscape conservation organization, but it's also, and really importantly, a large landscape conservation idea. Why here is a logical question. The Yellowstone to Yukon region is the most intact mountain landscape on the planet. All of the native species that were here before white folks colonized it are still here. They're not everywhere, but they are still here in some representation. And grizzly bears are an important indicator of this sort of last best chance idea. So this map shows in pink the historic range of grizzly bears on this continent. In sort of the reddy brown color, you can see the sort of freckling in the Western US. That's where the range was in 1922. And then in green, you can see where it has sort of receded to today. The Yellowstone to Yukon region is an opportunity to keep grizzly bears on the landscape. And because they're still here in such significant numbers, it's actually an opportunity to return them to where they've been lost. Now, the animal that is sort of the individual animal that's most closely associated with Y2Y is a wolf named Pluie. Speaking of wolf color, Elliot. Pluie was trapped just south of where I am today in Kananaskis country in Alberta in the early 1990s. They give them a radio collar at the time that was like the size of a brick around their neck. And Pluie the wolf carried that radio collar more than 3,800 square miles. So that's 10 times the size of Banff National Park. She crossed between 2 countries, between 2 provinces, 3 states, through the territories of a dozen Indigenous nations. And in 1993, she was found with her 2 pups, all of them legally shot outside Invermere, BC. So Pluie and other animals like her have pointed biologists to large landscape conservation, which is conservation at a geographic and time scale that reflects the needs of wide-ranging animal species like wolves. So Banff National Park, Canada's iconic premier national park, is not big enough for a 100-pound wolf. It isn't big enough for grizzly bears. It isn't big enough for wolverines. And it certainly isn't big enough for caribou, since the last of Banff's caribou died in 2008. This always is a weird thing to say, but large landscape conservation in the Rocky Mountains is actually rooted in the theory of island biogeography. And the basic premise goes like this: the biodiversity that is present on an island is the result of the number of species that have found that island minus the number of species that have died out on that island. Makes sense, right? So it's arrivals minus departures equals population. But there are a few other rules that make biodiversity on islands really difficult to maintain. First, the smaller an island is, like Island 1, and the farther away it is, the less likely it is that new arrivals will find it. 2, the smaller an island is, the fewer individuals the island will be able to feed. And 3, the smaller an island is, the more vulnerable the entire population of that island is to a catastrophic event, maybe a volcano or a hurricane. So the smaller and farther away an island is, the less biodiversity it is likely to have, and the more vulnerable populations are to extinction. So how does that relate to the Rockies? Remember this map? We just looked at it. You can see the grizzly bear range shrinking, right? You see those islands of habitat, those freckles, and then you can see what happens to them. So it's easy to imagine an island as land surrounded by water, but we've actually made countless little islands on land by dividing habitats with roads, railways, towns and cities, industrial operations, even our recreation. Those various human developments and land uses that can actually prevent individuals and broader species from crossing from one place to another place. And those rules of island biogeography still apply on the land. So the smaller the habitat is and the farther away it is from a source population, the less likely it is that animals will find it. The smaller the habitat is, the fewer animals it will be able to feed. The smaller the habitat is, the more vulnerable the entire population of that island is to a catastrophic event, like an avalanche or climate change. So the smaller and farther away the habitat is from a source population, the less biodiversity it's likely to have, the more vulnerable that population is to extinction. That's what happened to Banff's caribou. It's what happened to those isolated grizzly populations on this map. It's what's happening to animals across the continent and around the world right now. Isolation means vulnerability, it means inbreeding, and eventually it leads to extinction. And that means the opposite is also true. So connectivity, the ability to move freely through the landscape, means health. It means genetic interconnectedness. It means resilience to change, including climate change. And that's what the Y2Y vision is all about. And it's what Y2Y, the organization, works towards. And that big vision and the organization that organizes around it has actually been quite successful. I'm just going to shout out this paper really quickly. It outlines the conservation achievements in the Yellowstone to Yukon region since 1993. It's from last year. It's not my focus. I'm not going to dwell on it. But the short version is that land protections have grown in this region faster since 1993 than they did before, almost twice as fast. Protections have grown faster here, while the rate of growth has slowed or stagnated in other comparable regions. And the US population of grizzlies in our 3 key recovery zones has increased from 400 to 1,700 individuals. And they're actually also reclaiming a lot of that habitat outside of protected areas. And that's kind of the heart of large landscape conservation. So the Y2Y vision has been pretty successful over the last 29 years now. But I'm more interested in the future at this point. The lessons of the past are really valuable, but we have to understand them in the context of the present and also in our expectations of what's to come. There's obviously a lot of directions we can go there, But there may be no bigger game changer for large landscape conservation in the Yellowstone to Yukon region, and in fact, in many parts of the world, than movements for Indigenous rights and sovereignty. So broadly speaking, what I'm talking about here are social movements aiming to increase decision-making authority by Indigenous nations and communities over land, resources, and society, particularly within homelands that extend way beyond reserves and reservations. And for some context to that, 2.3% of the lands in the United States are reservation lands. In Canada, it's 0.2% that is designated as reserves. Yet, as we saw in that one of those opening slides, every piece of this continent is a homeland for at least one and usually several Indigenous nations. So when we talk about the loss of habitat for wildlife, we talk about this threat of extirpation and extinction. The loss of Indigenous lands and the fragmentation of Indigenous communities has a pretty similar effect. And when we're talking about people, that potential outcome is called genocide. Why do Indigenous rights and sovereignty movements have particular implications for large landscape conservation? Basically because Indigenous territories are large, and movements that increase Indigenous decision-making authority over their territories represents a huge shift in authority when it comes to determining what can and can't happen on the land. One sort of subset of this movement, or these movements, is known as land back. This is a quote from Jesse Wente, who's an Ojibwe journalist, that really emphasizes access to land under terms decided by Indigenous people. So the land back movement is what it says that it is. It is a movement to get land back. And I want to say one quick thing about stories, because I cannot help myself. That's my background. Stories invent and define places, and they set boundaries on who does and does not belong in those places. Stories are immensely powerful, and the Y2Y vision is in fact an example of that. Now let me remind you that the Y2Y vision, this large landscape geography that is created through the Y2Y story, overlaps with the homelands of more than 75 distinct Indigenous nations and communities, each of whom have their own stories, their own geographies, and their own boundaries for belonging. Somewhat more pragmatically than stories, I'd like to spend a little time here looking at how Indigenous sovereignty movements like Land Back are forcing large landscape conservation to shift, how I expect them to continue to do that in the coming decades. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some recent Y2Y work that I think illustrates both how we're beginning to incorporate these lessons and some of the questions that are very much still outstanding. So see, these are some of the implications. First, we will not be able to talk about connectivity without talking about reconnecting Indigenous lands, communities, and lifeways. Second, as the legal, social, and political environments shift, we will not be able to advance protected areas without Indigenous leadership. And third, we have to build right relations across difference if we hope to be relevant. And that means we have to know our role. A few years ago, I watched a documentary film in Banff. I thought it was really fantastic. It was made by the Nakota AV Club, which is a youth filmmaking collaborative from Niitsítapi, which is a Stoney Nakoda First Nation reserve right east of where I am. I can almost see it. I wanted to work with them after I saw it, so I caught up with some of the filmmakers after the screening. I wrote to them, I booked a conference room, I baked muffins, brought my 4-month-old baby to meet with them more than once. And I did it again, over and over, because I was invited to do so, even though there wasn't really a clear project on the table. We actually spent close to 2 years getting to know each other. And I knew that I was being evaluated and even tested a little bit. And I knew that that was because of mistrust between many Indigenous people and settler institutions like Y2Y, and specifically on communications projects, which of course have the capacity to commandeer Indigenous voice, and with conservation projects that have a really, really awful habit of excluding Indigenous people from their lands and resources. So for some specific context to where we're working, in this part of the world, conservation has played a huge role in colonization. Canada's first national parks, for example, were designed and designated in order to compensate railroad companies for unifying the new country of Canada from east to west. National parks were a federal claim over sacred Indigenous lands with the purpose of attracting wealthy visitors for the financial benefit of railroad tycoons and the political benefit of the colonizing government. Indigenous people were forcefully removed and legally excluded from these lands, often with a conservationist rationale about wasteful native hunters. National park boundaries became really hard defining lines across which Indigenous people could not travel. And in that respect, it was one of the central tools in this landscape for forcing Indigenous people onto reserves, into residential schools, and into the child welfare system, all of which has systematically impoverished and disenfranchised Indigenous people. That's not totally unique to the Yellowstone to Yukon region, but conservation in this landscape hasn't really grappled with it to a big degree. And that includes the ongoing ramifications of that history. So conservation efforts like Y2Y are often distrusted, and for good reason. Now, the project that the Nakota AV Club eventually decided to work with us on was the effort to get a wildlife overpass built on the Trans-Canada Highway just outside the reserve. So that's a land bridge over the highway to help animals cross from one side to the other safely. We spent months talking about wildlife crossing structures, and from Y2Y, we talk a lot about wildlife connectivity, genetic diversity across large landscapes, and the human safety and financial benefits for drivers of this kind of mitigation. And this is what Jarrett Two Young Man, the club's lead director, had to say. When we first started learning about this, the youth said that they felt for the animals because they have lost people they loved on that highway too. They could see right away how unfair it was when a highway was built through your home and you didn't really have a say in it. So when we talk about the importance of connectivity along the length of the Rocky Mountains, the young filmmakers are describing how their homelands extend from Jasper into Montana, how their families used to travel throughout those territories to sustain themselves and their cultures and their communities, and how colonization has broken that relationship. We helped the Nakota AV Club make what I think is a really fantastic short animation about wildlife crossings. We've continued to work together since. And the wildlife overpass that we had spent 10 years trying to convince the government of Alberta to build began construction this last April. And the Nakota AV Club, this youth filmmaking group, had a lot to do with that. So we can look at this as a successful partnership, right? We got the overpass that we were struggling to get. But that big lesson really lingers, and the question remains about how we're going to address it. How committed will we be to reconnecting Indigenous communities, lands, and lifeways? Because we've been asked to do that and to show that commitment. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Jumbo Wild campaign. It was active for like 30 years. Patagonia made a high-profile documentary about it. You can buy Jumbo Wild t-shirts from the website. The actual land in question is in southeast British Columbia. It's the headwaters of the Columbia River. It's also the heart of the Cabinet-Purcell Mountain Corridor, which is one of only 2 regions where grizzly bears are able to move across the Canada-US border. And as a result, it's one of the primary reasons grizzly bears in the US are recovering in their numbers. They're moving there from places like the Jumbo Valley. A 4-season ski resort and real estate development was first proposed there in 1991. It received significant support from the provincial government. There were processes that literally and formally prioritized ski resort development over grizzly bears. And environmental campaigners did a ton of incredible work for a very long time. But the greatest challenge to the proposal came from the Ktunaxa First Nation. Now, the Ktunaxa recognize these lands as Katmuk, where grizzly bears dance. It is where the grizzly bear spirit retreated to make space for the first people, and in exchange, those people, the Ktunaxa people, would take good care of the land. So Katmuk is the home of grizzly bears. It is also home to the essential grizzly bear spirit that makes all grizzly bears possible. In 2010, the Ktunaxa Nation issued the Katmuk Declaration, which they describe as an expression of Ktunaxa sovereignty that outlines stewardship principles for the Katmuk area, which would ensure the preservation and protection of this area for future generations. The Ktunaxa Nation eventually brought their complaint to the Supreme Court of Canada on the basis that the development would infringe their charter right to freedom of religion, because the land in question and the grizzly bear spirit are essential to Ktunaxa religious life. And the Supreme Court disagreed, in effect arguing that under Canadian law, place and religion are unbound. Land, is not part of religion under the law. I don't know any Indigenous worldview that would agree with that. Fortunately for the Ktunaxa and the Grizzly Bear Spirit, a provincial court ruled in 2019 that the environmental assessment certificate for the project had expired without meaningful construction taking place. The project got put on pause. And during that pause, the federal government, so not the Supreme Court, but the political branches of the Canadian government, announced that they would give the Ktunaxa Nation $16 million to study and manage an Indigenous protected area for the Katmuk region that would include those resort and real estate lands. Seeing the political trends turning against them and towards Indigenous-led conservation, the development proponent accepted an offer from the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is a land trust, and returned all permits to the province. So a Katmuk Indigenous protected and conserved area is in the works right now. Finalization is scheduled for later this year, officially. We'll see. In this part of the world, there will be no significant new land protections without Indigenous leadership. Every time I've done a presentation like this, I have intended to talk about the West Moberly and Saulteaux nations and their really remarkable records of land protection and species recovery, particularly caribou recovery. But I am eager to pass this off to Latasha and Elliot. I think my final lesson is pretty clear by now too. We need to know what role to play in respect to Indigenous-led work, and that requires honest relationships of reciprocity. Now, again, for context, federally mandated duty to consult requirements on major industrial and infrastructure projects mean that industry is constantly pursuing formal consultations with First Nations governments. Those projects come with compensation for participation often. They come with economic benefit agreements if consultation is successful. So there are legal requirements to engage, and there's clear benefits to engaging. And now, consequently, there is overburden on Indigenous governments, what we often call consultation fatigue. So as an environmental nonprofit, we have neither the legal mandate nor the financial resources to compete with industry. So what we tend to do instead is we ask nations, Indigenous nations and communities to participate in what is already very clearly defined work for us. And then we wonder why we struggle to get to the table. So I would argue that one of our primary limitations in this is that we don't always figure out our role. We can't be partners in the way industry can, and we're not decision makers in the way governments are. So what about facilitators and enablers? What about using the limited resources that we have to create space in which Indigenous people can reclaim their own relationships to the lands and animals that we're always seeking to protect, as we were able to do on a very small scale with the Nakota AV Club? That project, as small as it was, has helped empower Indigenous youth to act in defense of their homelands and their own reconnected communities, and to communicate their claims to this place through story. We were part of it. We helped make it happen, but we did not tell them what that story was going to be. And maybe we can scale up that kind of work. What about supporting the legal challenges that are reshaping Canadian law and politics in growing recognition of the often illegal and immoral foundations of the Canadian state? So we saw from Katmuk that Ktunaxa sovereignty, that sovereignty that they have actively claimed for themselves, would have protected those lands decades ago. Just as West Moberly and Saulteaux sovereignty would have stopped the catastrophic Site C dam and much more broadly recovered caribou populations. So perhaps our role is to fundraise for these legal challenges requested by Indigenous people, sometimes providing scientific perspective as it's needed. Sometimes even our role is just to get out of the way. So the future of large landscape conservation will have to acknowledge that large landscapes are Indigenous lands, and Indigenous people are taking them back. As for the large landscape vision, Indigenous sovereignty movements suggest that vision still has value. Certainly in my experience, it frequently resonates with Indigenous worldviews in that it disregards state boundaries and preference for animals and ecosystems. But its application, the story it is used to tell, is likely to look quite different over the next 25 years as power shifts away from colonial organizations and governments toward Indigenous peoples. Thank you for listening, and please join me in welcoming Latasha Robe.
You can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. So again, my name is Latasha Caprope. I'm from the Blood Tribe of, which is currently located in southern Alberta. So it encompasses, the Blood Tribe straddles right along the US-Canada border. And I'll be talking a little bit about Blackfoot territory in my presentation to give everybody a better idea of where the Blackfoot have been since time immemorial. So I'm here today to talk on behalf of Niitsítapi Water Protectors. We are a grassroots collective of Niitsítapi people who are interested and gathering to protect the waters and lands within the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We joined as a collective back in 2020, I believe, in response to the threat of open pit coal mining within the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. We've done a whole lot of work since then on a federal, a provincial, a tribal government level, you name it. We've even crossed the Canada-US boundary and have worked with our relatives down in Niitsítapi to help talk about water and what water relations mean for the Blackfoot Confederacy, what these areas mean, how to protect them. I always like to state that there's a common misconception about the Blackfoot. We're often referred to as the children of the plains, as First Nations who only existed in the plains area. And while that is true, we also existed in the mountains and the eastern slopes of the Rockies. They are one of the borders of our territory, and we have great knowledge and expertise of these areas. Our creation stories are rooted in lots of these mountain landscapes, and with those stories comes the knowledge of how to sustain and maintain these areas, as we have done for thousands upon thousands of years. It's just in a recent history since Europeans came over that these landscapes unfortunately started to desecrate because of the removal of First Nations, the removal of animals from these areas, the imposement of the reserve system. All of these types of things unfortunately have led to these areas not being as intact or as healthy as they should be. So that's a little bit about what NWP does. Most kind of commonly, what we did unify over was, again, the threat of open pit coal mines. So we have led as a collective, like I said, we focus on a national and international level and a provincial level, because I think when we think about coal projects or any type of industry development projects, I'm not entirely sure how it works in the US, but in Canada, there's usually multiple levels of approval that a company has to go through. They'll have to get often provincial approvals as well as federal approvals. They work with stakeholders, and nowhere in those conversations often is there Indigenous peoples. If there is, it's often done at a tribal government level. And unfortunately, that doesn't always make its way into community. So when Niitsítapi Water Protectors came together, it was actually in response to the Grassy Mountain coal development project, which is located in the eastern slopes. That project was actually a historic mine project, and an Australian-owned mining company was coming in hoping to restart that mine. These areas where we're located on, there's not a whole lot of water here. We don't have great big vast lakes as you'll find in other places of Canada. We actually have very, very small rivers that aren't, they're very small. For us, this is just what we're used to in living here. And so when a project like a coal mine comes in, which requires vast amounts of water to clean and manage coal, it's very concerning because of how much overproduction is already done in these areas, from mining, logging, farming, agriculture activities, you name it, is all existing in these areas all at once. So when NWP came, Niitsítapi Water Protectors came in, we were really focused on that one coal project, because that project alone required the majority of the water, of the limited water resources that we have in these areas. The threat of contamination was also serious because contamination from coal development doesn't just impact, it doesn't just stay where it is. The process of open pit mining is actually the process of removing a mountaintop and drilling into the mountain to extract coal from it. In that process, there's air contamination, there's water contamination. And if you've ever been to this area, we experience over 100-kilometer winds sometimes. So that contamination would go straight across the prairies into lots of our homes where we already don't have secure and safe water in many reserve homes. This here is actually an example of what an open pit coal mine looks like. And this one here is right on the BC Alberta border. This one here is the Elk Valley coal mine, which is owned by Teck Resources. And this one's really important to highlight because while this project is located within British Columbia on the Canadian side of the border, the water contamination actually flows into the US, and there's a whole bunch of litigation in place right now, legal action from the United States against Canada for the contamination that is being caused by this mine here. So you can see that just like water flows across boundaries, it flows across provincial boundaries, it flows across the Canada-US border quite freely. So does contamination when it happens. So does the destruction when these water sources are contaminated. And this is a really good example of that. So there's a few different things that Niitsítapi Water Protectors is focused on, because while it would be easy to say that, we rallied against coal, that it is really important, and that's a lot of the work that we've done. But most importantly, what we strive and what we gather for is the protection of Niitsítapi, which is our Blackfoot way of life. And similar to what Adam was talking about earlier, as Blackfoot, we have moved freely across these lands for thousands of years. From a Blackfoot worldview and in our teachings, we know that we don't exist above the environment or above animals. We actually exist in it, as part of it. And our role as Niitsítapi, we were actually put here to help protect these areas, to support these things, and the vastness of knowledge that we had over multiple different ecosystems and landscapes, going from the eastern slopes and Rocky Mountain areas into a dry desert-like area. It all existed within our territories, and we had the knowledge of how to help support and sustain these environments in relation to all the animals that were there. On the slide here, you'll see an image of Blackfoot territory. And this one here, our territory expands quite large. What you'll often hear is that the Blackfoot territory expands from the North Saskatchewan River up near Edmonton, Alberta, down along the Rocky Mountains, all the way south to the Yellowstone River, right where Yellowstone National Park is, and expands eastward into the greater part of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So a vast area. And this is where we have existed, and this was the lands that we were put here to help protect and steward since time immemorial. This is also where Blackfoot science thrives and exists. Those stewardship practices that are embedded into our cultural practice, they live here, and they serve a purpose. Everything in our Blackfoot, we don't just do something to do it. Everything that we do has a purpose and a meaning, and it can tie to a whole bunch of other things. So when we talk about Blackfoot science and we talk about our worldview, lots of our ceremonial practices are also tied into that as well. And those ceremonies that we have and we continue to practice and keep alive, those are what also help to keep the land healthy and intact. And embedded into those ceremonies are stewardship practices of, for lack of a better word, Blackfoot conservation and what that can look like, how we've been able to keep these lands intact. So this is one of our main priorities, because through healthy water, you get healthy land, and through healthy land, you get healthy communities. And this is a continual cycle that has existed. And unfortunately, with the impacts of colonization, we see how that structure starts to get fragmented. And when we don't have healthy communities, it can impact how our relations to land might be, and fragment those things and cause this destruction. Here's another image of Blackfoot territory. I want to caution you here. I use this image, one, because it still helps to show the vastness of Blackfoot territory. As you can see, it spans across what is now known as the Canada-US border, across multiple provinces here in Canada. But the lines are a colonial construct. These lines that are imposed in this version of a map, we know that through lots of Blackfoot landmarks, we exist well into Missoula and Butte area. We expand more northward. We have Blackfoot markers that are very old that exist outside of these green lines here. But I use this map to help show, just to help situate you of where the areas that I'm talking about. And when I talk about coal development, we're talking about right here in this little lightning bolt here. Those are the eastern slopes. And you can see by the vastness of Blackfoot territory here that as Blackfoot, we were also put in this area for a reason, because we were able to oversee and protect numerous headwaters. The headwaters that I'm talking about when we talk about coal development is the headwaters of the Old Man River. The Old Man River is actually located, well, yeah, kind of in southern Alberta area, but that river itself, it flows clear across the plains here, and it meets up with the Bow River, which later meets up with the South Saskatchewan River and flows right across and eventually drains into the Hudson's Bay. The Hudson's Bay then meets up, or the waters of the Hudson's Bay touch Nunavut, oh, my geography is not that good, Nunavut, Ontario, and Quebec. So when we talk about water contamination up in this area, it actually can flow clear across the greater part of Canada. And as Blackfoot, we knew this, and this is why in lots of our practices, we protected these areas to help keep them intact, because we knew of how important these headwaters are, not just of the Old Man, but of the numerous ones that fall within our territories. I also want to mention that the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, we have four nation Blackfoot speaking nations. So the Blood Tribe are Kainai First Nation, where I'm from, Siksika, Piikani, and Amskapi Piikani. Amskapi Piikani might be one that's everyone here is familiar, because they currently reside on the within Browning area of Montana, and their reservation is down here. In Canada, we have a treaty signing process, and this is also really important to talk about, and what NWP has highlighted in lots of our work related to coal, fighting against coal development, is highlighting the Blackfoot Treaty and what this treaty meant. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as Treaty Number 7, but we know it as the Blackfoot Treaty because originally it was supposed to be signed with just the Blackfoot nations. And the reason it was supposed to be signed with just the Blackfoot nations is because the now Canadian government knew that these areas were occupied by the Blackfoot, and these were our lands. So this treaty is really important, and it comes up in conversation a lot because treaties are signed between nations. These were the Blackfoot nations entering into treaty with the British Crown, which is now the government of Canada here. And these treaties, they were not land surrender treaties. And that's really important to highlight because this is something that provincial and federal governments like to use and say, no, First Nations surrendered their land through these treaties, and that is 100% false. These are not land surrender treaties. These are treaties that we entered into to agree to how to share and live on the land together. Were not land surrender treaties, and there's all kinds of reading that you can do into Treaty Number 7. There's 11 different numbered treaties in Canada, and these are really important because these are things that when we talk about industry or conservation, they fail to acknowledge treaties and all of the work that they do and the sacredness that treaties hold, the legal obligations that treaties hold. And with that, with neglecting all of those, they fail to see the opportunities for conservation that treaties can help push forth across really large areas of land. So I'm going to use kind of coal as an example of poor conservation in Alberta. The 1976 coal policy is a really important policy to highlight, and this is something that Niitsítapi water protectors had to focus in a lot, because in Alberta, we would say something like, there's going to be coal mines, and people would be like, no, there's not. We don't mine coal in Alberta. It's not something that people see, because there wasn't a lot of coal activities for quite a while since the 1970s in Alberta. And the reason there wasn't a whole lot of coal mine development in these areas is because of what's known as the 1976 coal policy, which was created by the Alberta Lougheed government in that time. And what this policy did is it restricted coal development. It used a category system to restrict coal development in priority areas, or areas that were of significance that needed to stay intact. So category 1 would actually include lots of areas like Banff National Park and Waterton National Park, and these areas that were seen as protected by Western standards of provincial or federal parks. Category 2 was there is only allowed limited exploration and no surface coal mining, because I mentioned how open pit mining or surface mining is really harmful for the environment and everything around it. Category 3, they saw it as, it's still important, but there's some exceptions to be made there. And in category 4, as long as companies went through the federal and provincial regulatory processes, they could have a coal mine if they wanted to. What you'll notice here is that when we think about the treaty areas, treaty isn't mentioned in any of these things. And when NWP came in, what the Alberta government had done is actually they rescinded the coal policy in the middle of the pandemic without notifying anybody. The UCP government decided that it was time to bring back coal mining. They decided that coal offered vast economic opportunities for the province, and that this was an outdated policy that needed to be removed to allow for coal development in these areas. What they failed to do in that process was to consult with First Nations. In Canada, we have a chief and council system. They failed to do their consultation with First Nations. They also failed to engage with lots of environmental NGOs, or Albertans for that matter. They've removed this policy on a Friday before a long weekend, and that was it. And as they rescinded that policy, I kid you not, that coal exploration trucks were there waiting with their coal leases, and onto the mountainsides they went. So the duty to consult that Adam had mentioned, it's there. It's legally there. It isn't always carried through, or the ways that the Alberta government will choose when or not to consult. They often put that onus of consultation onto the company instead of doing consultation themselves with First Nations. Some tribal governments did raise concern about this. And this was all, it wasn't a lot of public knowledge. There wasn't outcries about this. There started to be some outcry, but nobody knew that this had even happened. First Nations didn't know. Tribal governments didn't get a notification that this was happening, yet it was having huge environmental impacts and infringements on treaty and Indigenous rights in this area. And so here's kind of some more maps of where these proposed coal projects was. And I talked about the Grassy Mountain coal mine, and that's when, I had started to hear about these projects, and unfortunately really quickly learned that it wasn't just one project that we were facing. There was numerous, up to 11 different coal mines being proposed in these areas here, and you can see them here, most of them owned by Australian mining companies, all situated in the same area. Right in the headwaters of the Old Man here, of the Old Man River. And you can see the proximity here between the Blood Reserve where I've lived most of my life. There's also the Bigani Reserve, and how close these areas to where these proposed projects were going to be. Got a whole lot of slides to get through, so I should talk faster. Another map here. The impacts of mining, there are many, there's numerous impacts. And I think when I think about the work that NWP did with this project, we had a couple hurdles to get through. We had to notify our communities that this was happening, because every time I phoned somebody up, they didn't know that these coal mines were at their doorstep. They didn't know that lots of these mines were already in the approval process and that this policy had been rescinded. They also didn't know about the impacts that these coal development mines could have on them, anything from health and safety, the impacts on wildlife and plants and medicines and hunting, the impacts on who we are as Blackfoot, the impacts that these coal mines could have on our ceremony and on our Blackfoot way of life. And this isn't just the Blackfoot. In Alberta here, there's 3 different treaty areas that are within the province of Alberta. There's 45 recognized First Nations communities within Alberta, all of whom would be impacted by this because of how water flows. It flows into all of our communities, and it didn't matter that they're in Northern Alberta. They would still feel the impacts of coal development. So things like Adam was referring to, animals do need to move freely across these areas. And when coal is developed, there's a lot of exploration that happens. And through that, there's a lot of explosions and through the drilling process. And that can hugely impact how animals migrate through an area. And so everybody was going to be impacted through this, yet no Indigenous consultation was taking place. And I bring you back to that 1976 coal policy, because when this policy was created and the way that it's talked about in Alberta, it's talked about as this revolutionary policy, that the government at the time had an eye on conservation. They saw the value of the land, and as a result, they created this policy. But what this policy fails to do is mention anything about treaty or Indigenous rights. When this policy was created, they also didn't engage with Indigenous peoples in the creation of it. And had they done that, if they took that time to consult with Indigenous peoples, to meet with them, they would have recognized that a category system of land protection doesn't work. Land doesn't work that way. It doesn't matter if there's a fence across the land, contamination will span across that fence. A category system doesn't work. And in a Blackfoot worldview, these things are all connected. You can't separate an area out just by putting a fence around it. If there's a coal mine on this side of the fence, it's going to impact the other side of the fence as well. And so that policy wasn't as revolutionary as they thought it would be. And they were seeing the impacts of this now. These areas, Niitsítapi water protectors, I talked about the importance of our Blackfoot way of life, and it is really important to me and to my communities. And these areas, they hold creation stories. These are the places that we bring our children out to teach them who they are, to teach them how to take care of the land. And these areas here were and continue to be under threat. I already mentioned some of the stuff here with the 1976 coal policy. There was a lack of Indigenous consultation and engagement. There was no recognition of Indigenous sciences and connection to land or traditional ecological knowledge. It also predates Section 35 of the Canada Constitution Act, the work that has been done through the United Nations and the Declaration on Indigenous Rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And there's been many other Supreme Court rulings, some of them Adam had mentioned in his presentation, that all refer to Indigenous rights and our rights on our lands. Some of these rights are, in Canada, there's different legal frameworks that are used, such as Indigenous inherent rights and our treaty and Aboriginal rights, all of whom are impacted whenever there's a destruction on the land. And destruction can look a whole bunch of different ways. It doesn't just have to be a coal project. It can be the creation of a new national park. When national parks are a really poor system, because what they do is they keep Indigenous people out. They say that conservation has to look this way. It has to look like no human engagement. But what we see in lots of national parks here is overgrow of brush, which makes it them more prone to forest fires. And we've seen these forest fires happen in Banff National Park, in Waterton National Park, all of which could have been avoided if Indigenous peoples were allowed to go in there and practice their ways of life. Cumulative impacts. Lots of environmental policy also fails to recognize cumulative impacts and what this is. They try to look at things as a project by project basis, but you can't do that. The impacts that we put on the land, they continue to build up, and by looking at things in a fragmented way, as lots of Western systems like to do, they fail to see the big picture of the impacts that are happening on a landscape and across ecosystems. Cumulative impacts in a legal framework are also really important to the conversation about Indigenous rights and movements like land back, because we have already been reduced to such small areas where we can practice our rights openly and freely, and these continue to be stripped away. Anytime a farmer gets a grazing lease, we lose access to land in areas that we should be able to go and hunt and harvest. Every time a new coal mine pops up, we lose more. Every time a new highway is proposed, those pieces of intact land get smaller and smaller and smaller. Western frameworks for land use planning in many places, I'm going to guess in the US as well, they're focused around the needs of the economy and focused around the needs of industry. They're not actually focused around the needs of the land. And so when they're doing land use planning, oftentimes they're I can't even say that word right now. They're looking at the land in pieces, and instead of looking at, what do we need to do to ensure that the land will be here for another 7 generations, they're looking at how much can we take right now so that this project can get a green light. And these don't align with Indigenous worldviews. Oftentimes in this process, Indigenous organizations like my NWP, anything that's outside of tribal government, if we start speaking up about things, we're lumped together with NGOs, and that isn't where we belong, because we bring a lot of we have more concerns outside of just environmental concerns. They'll lump us in as special interest groups, and we're not special interest groups either. So there's a failure to recognize how and where we fit in, because their systems are not complex enough to acknowledge the vastness that comes along with human relations to land. And because of that space, Indigenous peoples, whenever we bring these concerns for the environment, they're like, no, this is an Indigenous rights issue. You got to go over here to this department. You don't belong in these conversations, when really they're two of the same conversations. This one here is a really big one when we think about the work of conservation and Indigenous peoples, is there's such a lack of representation and traditional ecological knowledge. And these stems from a lot of different things, such as white supremacy culture here in Canada and the US. These stem from systems of injustice that currently still exists, and numerous structural barriers in place to limit Indigenous participation in environmental work. And so I bring you back to this, that, change can happen, and change is happening. And Indigenous people, it doesn't matter, will continue to raise their voices. This is an event that we held downtown on the streets of Calgary, where we had hundreds of people show up because they also believed in the importance of water and the importance of protecting and keeping landscapes intact. These movements are happening all over the place, and the role of allies or non-Indigenous led organizations sometimes is to help amplify. We've had numerous examples of where people didn't support us in our vision, but we kept moving and we kept thriving through, and through lots of work that we've done, bringing acknowledgement to treaty rights, to Blackfoot ways of knowing, to the flaws of conservation systems. We have been able to, at least for the time being, halt these coal development projects. So this does work. And if it wasn't for the Indigenous voices coming in to that conversation around coal, those projects would be approved right now. It's through the work of community that we've been able to stop and halt lots of those projects. And I'll give it to Elliot.
Thank you so much, Latasha. That was wonderful. I just want to remind Elliot, as you go, maybe leave a few minutes for questions before you wrap up, if you don't mind doing that. Thank you so much. Elliot.
Oh, hi. Sorry. Multitasking here is just doing some laundry. Anyway, yeah, thanks, Adam and Latasha. Really great information. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Blackfoot Confederacy Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk Native Trout Recovery Project. It's a Blackfoot shared leadership and capacity support in native trout recovery, climate change, non-native species, and habitat loss. So our project started in 2020. We wrote a proposal of the Blackfoot Confederacy. They asked our biologist and myself to develop this proposal and submit it to Environment and Climate Change Canada. It's the federal department, or it's a federal department. And so there's two funds under the program. It's called AFSAR for short. So there's the terrestrial fund and there's the aquatic fund. So because our project is focused on fish, we were funded through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And since when we got going, there's so this middle logo is the Blackfoot Confederacy Tribal Council logo. And the four on the left here is the Piikani Nation, the Kainai or the Blood Tribe, Siksika, and Amskapi Piikani, or the Blackfeet, and they're in northern Montana. Yeah, so before I get going on the presentation, I'm just going to talk about some general concepts about the Blackfoot people. So the Blackfoot people have existed in this part of the continent for millennia, tens of thousands of years, and consist of four tribes or nations: the Kainai, that's my tribe, the Piikani Nation, the Siksika Nation, they're in Canada, and the Amskapi Piikani Nation, or the Blackfeet tribe, and yeah, they're in northern Montana. So all four tribes practice the same customs and ceremonies and speak the same language, although there are slight variations of dialects with each tribe. The Blackfoot people believe they are part of the whole universe, including the sky people or spirits, the land animal spirits, the four-leggeds and two-leggeds, including humans, the animal or the flying spirits, birds, and the underwater spirits, beavers, muskrats, otters, and fish, among others. The Blackfoot people believe that every plant, animal, even rocks, are animate or have energy and life, and that everything has a right to live. The Blackfoot people believe humans are part of the ecosystem or environment and not above it, and don't control life, as Latasha mentioned. The Blackfoot people believe that most native plants are medicines for humans and animals. The humans and animals doctor themselves and know what to eat or drink to heal when they feel sick. I'm just going to talk about transboundary partnerships. Just gotta fix my screen so I can see everything. Yeah, so transboundary partnerships. Since the creation of Canada and Alberta in 1867 and 1905, respectively, European settlement and development have encroached on the former prairie and mountain landscapes. We're part of Treaty 7. It was initially called the Blackfoot Treaty, but our two ally tribes were part of that. The Tsuut'ina, or we used to call them the Sarsi. They're just on the boundary of the city of Calgary in Alberta. And the Stoney Nakoda, Adam talked about them a bit. So the Tsuut'ina are Dene. So they they came south from what is now northern Alberta, and we took them on as allies. They were fleeing the Cree people. The Cree were one of our enemies, and so we took the Tsuut'ina in as allies, and then the Stoney Nakoda are Sioux. So they fled north from the U.S. cavalry when they massacred the Sioux in the U.S. So they fled north, and we took them on as allies. So they're part of Treaty 7. As a result, over the past 140 plus years, these landscapes have undergone significant changes as a result of disturbance, development, and cultivation of these lands. What were former natural ecosystems were transformed into developed and changed landscapes with different land jurisdictions that govern them. Here we are today and living in the significantly changed landscape, and there remains intact wilderness, albeit very reduced, and places we can still go and visit, see these wild areas where we can still see wildlife, fish, camp, and enjoy our surroundings. These areas are disappearing fast, so we're very lucky to still have these places to visit with our families. We don't take care of these areas and allow continued development, coal mining, oil and gas exploration, more cattle grazing, and off-highway vehicle use, among other things. We will have such a significant impact that our children and grandchildren will no longer be able to visit and enjoy these areas in the future. In order to maintain the wild areas that are left, we need to work together with all jurisdictions. I truly believe from my experience that we can sustain what's left of these beautiful landscapes by partnering with each other to do this. I'm going to show you some slides of how we can make this happen and how we're making this happen. This is in what we call, Latasha mentioned it, Nappy's Playground. It's the upper Oldman River watershed in southwest Alberta. This is the Livingston River. So I'm just going to talk about the Blackfoot Confederacy Tribal Council. They're a not-for-profit regional managing organization representing the Blackfoot Confederacy nations of Kainai, Niitsítapi, Kainai, and Niitsítapi. Our mission is to collaborate, restore, protect, honor, and enhance the collective culture, language, and self-identity of the Blackfoot people, and to establish political and economic sovereignty over Blackfoot territory, including natural resources, to the benefit of current and future generations of our people. I'm not going to read this whole slide. This explains the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. It was established in 2004. It facilitates active participation by Indigenous communities in the implementation of the Species at Risk Act, or SARA. It invests in organizational capacity, encourages activities that conserve and or recover species at risk, and supports community-led documentation and management of Indigenous knowledge. The objectives are to promote the conservation and recovery of aquatic species at risk in their habitats, and to support the engagement and participation of Indigenous peoples in Species at Risk stewardship and Species at Risk Act implementation. So as Tasha mentioned, this shows Blackfoot territory pre-contact. This slide is courtesy of Paulette Fox. She mapped out traditional Blackfoot territory as part of her master's thesis. So it included lands in what are now Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, and Wyoming, and was bounded on the west by the Rocky Mountains, on the north by the North Saskatchewan River, on the east by the Great Sand and Cypress Hills, and on the south by the Yellowstone River. But as Tasha alluded to, we're finding more sites beyond those boundaries. Latasha also mentioned that we're not just prairie people, we were mountain people, because there was plants and animals that we needed for ceremony and healing that weren't out on the plains. So we would venture into the mountains to get some of those plants and animals. So this is, again, the North Saskatchewan River, the Yellowstone. Here's the Bow and Old Man watersheds. And I'm just going to go back a second. As you can see, traditional Blackfoot territory is almost right in the heart of North America. So our study area is the Bow and Old Man River watershed. So it's a little gray areas here. And so that's the, that's the Old Man, or sorry, that's the Bow River. It drains out of Banff and into the, forms the South Saskatchewan and then joins the North Saskatchewan, and then it flows into Hudson Bay. And then this just shows the Blackfoot reserves, as we call them in Canada, or reservation, the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana. So that's kind of our study area. We're also part of the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. It's been called the Water Tower of North America. So water that flows from the Crown of the Continent flows east into Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean, southeast eventually into the Gulf of Mexico, and west to the Pacific Ocean through the Columbia River. This is it kind of blown up. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a green outline, and that's the Crown of the Continents. This is where I am, near Cardston, Lethbridge, Calgary, just for, I guess, better context. This is the Kainaiwa conservation region. And Adam talked about this. Yeah, so the Crown of the Continent ecosystem is within the Kainaiwa region. So it's a pretty important area. So I'm going to talk about our project. So challenges facing native trout, bull and West Slope cutthroat trout. Habitat loss resulting from human activities, mining, logging, grazing, and unfenced headwater streams, random camping, off-highway vehicle use, interaction of land use with climatic extremes, floods and droughts, and competition and hybridization with introduced non-native species, rainbow trout, brook trout, and brown trout. Yeah, and I want to mention that these are the two native trout that are native to the rivers in southern Alberta. So on top, we can see the bull trout, and the orangey kind of colored fish is the male. And then on the bottom is a brightly colored cutthroat male trout. So these trout are aquatic indicator species or keystone species of the rivers. So they're very important. If the indicator species are still there, it indicates that the watershed for the most part is still pretty healthy, but their populations have been declining recently over the past probably 50 to 75 years. So these two trout are both listed on the Canada Species at Risk Act. They're listed as threatened. So their populations are declining, but they're still there. So our project, it's two, I can't see my, just need a second here. So the purpose of our project is to build capacity and expertise as guardians of East Slope watershed integrity through training and mentorship in assessing, managing, and restoring in-stream and riparian native trout habitat, and to gather Blackfoot values and holistic ways of knowing about the study area, water, and native trout, and bring this together with scientifically derived watershed values in a respectful manner that increases Blackfoot engagement in native trout conservation and restoration activities. This is some of our crew doing spawning bed surveys for bull trout, or their scientific name is RED, R-E-D-D. That's a spawning bed. So this is Blair, he's from Begunny. This is Joe, he's from here, but he works with Parks Canada in Waterton. He came out a few times. This is Alvin First Rider on the left. I don't know if you can see my cursor. He's from the Kainai tribe. And this is Kimmy Hool. She's our project manager. She works for the Blackfoot Confederacy. So she was out in the field quite a bit the first year. So our objectives. We wanted to get one field technician from each Blackfoot nation to participate. Due to COVID, the Blackfeet tribe in Montana was unable to participate in the field activities until this past year due to the border crossing issues. So one field tech from each Blackfoot nation to participate in project field activities to learn methods and build capacity. Yeah, so we finally this year got technicians from all 4 nations and began training them. Well, we actually started training 3 years ago. So we conducted eDNA sampling or environmental DNA sampling in various tributaries of the Old Man and Bull River watersheds to determine the presence or absence of cutthroat and bull trout and other introduced trout species. So I'll talk about eDNA in a bit, but it's really non-invasive. I've been doing this work for 28 years now, including fish work. Before eDNA, if you wanted to find out what kind of fish was in whatever river, you'd either hike the stream with a backpack electrofisher, which is basically a battery, and you have an anode and a cathode. And so there's a wand in your hand, and you have your technicians around you. So you shock the water, and the fish are stunned briefly, and they float to the top. And then you net them, and then you can identify them. With eDNA, we didn't touch one fish. So they shed cells. And so we took 3 1-liter water samples, filtered the water through a little paper filter, probably in the US, a little bigger than a dollar-sized coin. And then we popped those in a little envelope. We had to be very careful not to contaminate with human DNA. And we sent it to the lab. We're working with the University of Victoria, Dr. Karen Helbing's lab. So we sent our water samples there. And I kind of forgot to mention the rest of our partners. So there's the 4 Blackfoot tribes and the Blackfoot Confederacy Tribal Council. And we've also got the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada that are funding a lot of it. Parks Canada, Waterton Lakes National Park is another partner. They've provided some funding too. The Alberta Environment, and I think it's Protected Areas now. They just changed their name. They supported us with some funding to pay for some of the eDNA samples and processing. And then we're another partner is Cows and Fish, or the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. Also the Old Man Watershed Council, Trout Unlimited Canada, and Fintegrate Fisheries and Watershed Consulting. That's our biologists company. So those were all our partners. We installed water temperature loggers in various tributaries of the Old Man and the Bull watersheds. We conducted stream habitat assessments and worked with various government and ENGOs, or environmental NGOs, to restore stream habitat that's been negatively affected by human development. We conducted cutthroat and bull trout red surveys, or spawning bed surveys, in various tributaries, the Old Man and Bull watersheds, to confirm cutthroat and bull trout spawning activity. Yeah, we got delayed until August when the pandemic started. So we were supposed to start in late June, but we didn't do cutthroat red surveys in year 1. Although Matthew, our biologist, and I went up and did a cutthroat red survey on Beaver Creek. It's in the Old Man watershed, and we did find cutthroat spawning. And we're interviewing elders from each of the 4 Blackfoot nations to document traditional ecological knowledge regarding the significance of native trout, water, and Blackfoot place names in traditional territory. So I've been doing the interviews. I've interviewed 14 elders so far, and I've got to do 6 more this winter. But yeah, I've learned so much from our elders, and I've learned a lot of history. So here's the bow. Whoops, sorry. The blue outline top around Calgary. That's the Bull River. So here's the Siksika Reserve just east of Calgary. And then the southern watershed is the Old Man River. There's the Beekani Reserve and our reserve. And this area here that Latasha kind of referred to where the coal mining is going on, we call that Napi's playground. So there's an old story where Napi wasn't playing, he was gambling. He's our Blackfoot trickster. He was gambling with the Tunaha or the Kootenai trickster. And so that's what we call Napi's playground. Yeah, so that's part of our study area. So I'll just go back. Yeah, so the first year we had a kickoff training, and it was out at a group campsite in the Upper Oldman River. So we had two of our elders, Mike Brewsted and William Big Bull, Ira Provost from Beekani, and we just did some training on site. Yeah, so that happened last year, June 28th and 29th. It was held in the headwaters of the Oldman River. It was opened by elders William Big Bull and Ira Provost of Beekani and elder Mike Brewsted of the Kainai Nation. We gave blessings and talked about the knowledge that is inherent in everything, the hills and mountains, water, fish, and wildlife. This included lands and consultation staff from Beekani, Siksika, and Ghana. Staff from the following agencies and groups were also at the workshop: Alberta Environment, Parks Canada, the Oldman Watershed Council, Cows and Fish, Trout Unlimited Canada, and the Niitsítapi Institute. They're a conservation group based in Calgary. So we covered the importance of the headwaters as source water areas, riparian vegetation function to maintain water quality and fish habitat, original and current range of native trout in Blackfoot territory, fish identification and differences between native and non-native trout, spawning behavior and red counts or nest counts, introduction to habitat disturbance and restoration, whirling disease in Blackfoot territory, impacts on trout testing and decontamination, stream temperature is an important variable for trout and how it is monitored, and environmental DNA, what it is. We did a demonstration and training and how to collect it. So here's our training. As you can see, we were right by the river, and then this bottom center photograph is we're filtering the eDNA samples through a little vacuum pump. So in our first year, we did a total of 19 days in the field. Last year, we did 33. This year, I think we did just around 30. We had participation from the 3 Canadian Blackfoot nations in all the different types of work. And finally, this year, we had participation with the Blackfeet tribe from Montana. So we took 36 eDNA samples, 30 from the old man, 6 from the bull. And that was for bull trout. For cutthroat trout, we did 18 eDNA samples, 12 from the old man and 6 from the bull. And we found cutthroat in some, but not in all the streams. This describes environmental DNA or eDNA. It's an invisible trail of DNA that organisms leave behind, including us humans. Organisms leave a trail of tissue behind them when they shed scales, skin, or hair, or other dead cells. DNA is made up of 4 nucleotides. I'm not going to get into DNA science here. I think some of you are into that, so you probably know what that is. Each species has its own unique DNA sequence. By collecting water samples and filtering the water, DNA from all the plants and animals in the water is captured on the filter. All the DNA from the filter is isolated and tested to see if any of it matches the genetic codes for the trout the Blackfoot Confederacy is looking for. So the UVic lab did 4 trout assays, or 4 DNA sequence codes for bull trout, cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, and brook trout. So rainbow and brook trout are not native to southern Alberta. They're introduced. So we could tell if there was brook, those 4 species in the rivers or not. So this is us just taking some samples. There's our biologist, Matthew. This is Carly Greer Stewart. She works with Parks Canada. but she came out and joined us. Yeah, this is our guy. Oops, sorry. Yeah, on the bottom right here, or in the center photograph, that's Blair. He's going to start filtering the water. And on the lower right picture is Alvin and Brent taking the filter out of the little slot, and they're going to just pop that in that little brown envelope in Alvin's hand. So we did some sampling in Evan Thomas Creek. Excuse me. That's in the Bow watershed, and there's no more cutthroat there, or there wasn't bull trout. So cutthroat disappeared from Evan Thomas Creek about 5 years ago. So we don't know what's going to happen, if they're going to restock it, or we're not sure. And then this little check mark here in the middle of the screen, we found a new cutthroat trout population in Shale Creek. And we detected a bull trout cutthroat trout in the St. Mary River, just north of the US border here. And this is bull trout results. We didn't detect any in those where the X's are. And we got a weak signal detected upstream of Cardston here that drains out of Glacier National Park and the Blackfeet Reservation. They do have bull trout. We worked with them this year, and they did confirm that. So this is the Shale Creek. We stopped to look at this culvert because it's such a bad, it's in really bad shape. It's not the way culvert should be installed. It cuts off river flow and connectivity of the whole stream. And we walked to the other side of the road, and there's this little pool there. So we took some samples, and we confirmed there's cutthroat in Shale Creek. So that's good, and hopefully they'll fix that culvert. And Shale Creek is right below Cabin Ridge coal exploration. This is right above Shale Creek, and Latasha talked about this. So no doubt any coal mining is probably going to wipe out that population of cutthroat. We're just checking for bull trout in Pincher Creek. We detected them right where we were at that picture. Or no, we didn't detect them, sorry, but we went upstream and we found them further upstream. This is us, just a whole bunch of pictures, just eDNA. So we can set up on a little table and filter our water, so it's really portable. These are some of the different rivers in the Bow River and the Old Man that we visited. I'm looking at the clock because I know I got to hurry. This is some of the results of the eDNA. So we're still waiting for results to fill in all the blank cells in this table for the year 3 report that's being sent to Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or DFO. So you can see in the Old Man River and Shale Creek, we got 8 out of 8 hits for Westlow cutthroat, so we know they're there. In Pincher Creek, 0 out of 8, so we know they're not there. Further upstream, we got detections of bull trout, so they're there, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what the results look like. Green cells indicate confirmed detection of DNA from the target species or taxon, fish, while orange cells indicate suspected detection. Habitat restoration was conducted on 6 streams in 2020, 4 in the Old Man, 2 in the Bow, and we were trained by an expert in the field, Dave Polster. He trained us on how to do that. It involved a variety of bioengineering techniques using live willow stakes. These are the 4 sites. We did 2 additional 2, one on the Blood Reserve near Standoff, the Belly River, and another one on the Begunny Reserve near Crow Lodge Creek that flows into the Old Man River. So we planted a whole bunch of willow stakes, probably in those 6 sites. I'm thinking 12 to 1,300 willow stakes we planted. Here's what it looks like. This is Dutch Creek in the Upper Old Man. Here's all the partners before we started our project. So we showed up, they trained us, and all these little, I guess, sticks that they look like sticks sticking out of the ground on this lower left. Those are the willows we planted. And here's more of that on a different creek. So yeah, you got to pound a crowbar to do a sort of a pilot hole, and then you pop the willow in, and it's usually 2 to 3 feet in length, the willow. Yeah, so that's kind of what it looks like. So even some of the gals grabbed some sledgehammers. So spawning or red surveys, 7 streams were surveyed in year 1. And yeah, so spawning is observed and confirmed in all streams surveyed for bull trout, which is good. Last year, we did surveys on 3 streams in the Old Man, Honeymoon Creek. Yeah, those streams. I'm just going to show a quick video here so you can see what it looks like. Oh, sorry.
Elliot, I just want to hop in here to be mindful of the time since it's past 5. But if you want to take a few minutes and
Okay,
wrap up.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So these are cutthroat, just so you can see. Yeah, so I'll get out of there. And there's another pic of bull trout, but that's I won't show it. Yeah, so that's just some of the places we went. Crow's Nest Mountains on the right. It's a really sacred site to the Blackfoot people. This is what spawning beds look like. It's the area highlighted in red on the lower left. We had to decontaminate our gear every time we went to a different stream because we didn't want to spread whirling disease. I'm just going to skip this. Yeah, so this is the Upper Old Man or Nappy's Playground. We found bull trout in all the streams we surveyed. This is right by the Canada-US border. We hiked into the US and found bull trout there. Yeah, this bull trout we found on the shore, he was taken by an eagle, and he's like 0.8 of a meter long. So he's a pretty big fish, and yeah, so definitely they still get preyed on. Again, more spawning beds, spawning surveys, water temperature data loggers. We installed them at all these sites. You pound a device that's connected to a rebar into the riverbed and activate it and come back next year, find it, and download all the data. So it takes hourly water temperatures every day for the whole year. So this just shows the graph printout the following year. Yeah, this is what they look like. These guys are pointing to them, or gals too. We did some fish rescues on irrigation diversions on the Old Man River and on the Lethbridge Northern Irrigation District and the Belly Waterton Canal. Okay, so this is connectivity to bull trout spawning habitat. Irrigation dams fragment river habitat in southwest Alberta. This is the Old Man River Dam. It dams 3 of these rivers. And the only way bull trout can't get up the dam. There's no fish passage. But we did find them spawning in Pincher Creek. So it's just not a good thing. Here's some of the fish we rescued. Brown trout and rainbow trout. So these aren't native. We didn't find any cutthroat. There's 1 bull trout. This is kind of what that looks like. It's a pretty big undertaking with a bunch of volunteers. I did 6 Blackfoot elder interviews the first year. Mike, Shirley, John, David passed away last year. So I'm glad I got him on tape. Clarence, Wilford, I asked them 3 questions. How are fish significant to the Blackfoot people? How is water significant? What are some traditional place names in Blackfoot territory? So yeah, so they obviously said we did eat fish, although some people said we didn't. Some ate a lot, some didn't eat much or any at all. They said they were, some of their families were avid fishermen, and they talked about eating fish in times of starvation. And they mentioned the Fish Eater clan, which Latasha is part of, and so am I. Water, yeah, I'm just gonna speed through these. There's quite a few traditional places that got mentioned. 5 main rivers where you get our paint. Those 5 rivers all in the Old Man watershed. We submitted the first 2-year reports. We'll submit the last one in March. And just wanted to thank all our partners that I mentioned and all our technicians. Okay, the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. This was really wonderful, and I can't wait to share it with everybody that wasn't able to be here for the seminar. It's been really interesting learning about the projects that you all have done, and we really appreciate you sharing that, and also the awesome work that you're all doing in your respective fields and regions. And I know we're past 5. I'm sorry I had to rush there at the end. Should have taken more time. But if there are any questions from the audience, you can definitely send them in the chat, and we'll hang out, and we can also share those with the panelists if they're okay with responding to them that way if they need to head off of Zoom now. But yeah, I want to just thank everyone for coming and participating, and thank you to our panelists. We really, really appreciate you guys being here. So we'll go ahead and call it, but if you do have questions, please send them in the chat, and I can pass those along if our panelists are okay with that. Cool. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's very interesting to hear about all the awesome work you guys are doing. So thank you guys. I need some thank yous in the chats. Cool. Well, I guess if there's no questions in the chat right now, we can hop off, but thank you guys so much again. And thank you everyone for being here. And we do have 2 more seminars planned for the spring. So if you're around and if you're on our email list, you'll receive information for those as well. And just thank you again, everyone, for being here.